Yes, greetings, Bantu Bagut. Greetings, comrades and friends. Look, I want to read here a chapter from a book called Hani, a life too short. I want to read chapter 7. It is titled the Memorandum. But what I'm going to read for now is not the memorandum itself, but a chapter that actually wants to explain or put into context the writing of the memorandum itself, so that perhaps one at a later stage get an opportunity to read the memorandum, and by the time one reads the memorandum, would have better appreciated the circumstances that led to the writing of the memorandum that was written by the late comrade Chris Hani and his comrades in the late 1960s, which is argued led to a conference in Morogoro, which is popularly known today as the Morogoro Conference. Without any further ado, I read chapter 7, the memorandum. Lying on his single bed, Hani was restless. Cold air blew through the openings at the top of the cell wall. Although reduced to wearing short pants, a jacket and a jersey, he found prison almost luxurious after months in the Rhodesian bush. Porridge in the mornings, meat, vegetables, sometimes even fish, a veritable feast. Still, this was not how it was supposed to be. Hani had crossed into newly independent Botswana with 3 other top soldiers in early September 1967, following a month of running battles with the Rhodesian security forces. The men were already heroes, as the progress of the Wanki campaign had been widely reported on. It was, after all, the first time South African Liberation Forces had properly engaged a substantial enemy force. But the skirmishes had taken a severe toll on the joint MK Zebra force, which had started out with 100 men. By the time Hani and his fellow commander, Zimbabwean John Dube, had set off into the night to look for water, leaving half of their group behind, there were only 8 in their company. It was a time for reflection and reappraisal. It was a time for Hani, who was at a critical juncture in his development as a fighter and a leader, to consider how he and his fellow soldiers had been sustained and championed the campaign and afterwards in prison, and by whom. Hani was typically reflective afterwards, saying in an interview that the Wanki campaign had failed to achieve its main objective, militarily speaking. But this was also a factor of his lack of ego. He could have elevated himself to the position of hero, because that is surely what he and his men had become. Instead, he described Wanki as an important experience for the organization. We were able to have a taste of military action. We were tempered in battle. We were tested under difficult conditions, and I think we succeeded. The standard of the soldiers was excellent. Our moral qualities, our conviction, and our toughness were exceptional, and we maintained a discipline and unity which very few armies would have under those circumstances. I mean, no regular army would have endured, marching all the way from there without proper logistics. That was army. By the time the mission was over, the detachment had covered more than 200 kilometers through dense bush and thorn trees, using the most fragile of supply lines. I mean, you judge yourself. Being around crossing from the Zambezi River near Livingstone and then to Botswana and going all in zigzags and not moving straight along a road. Although it was a turning point in terms of the struggle in Zimbabwe, the people of Zimbabwe felt the impact of that. The enemy couldn't suppress information about it. So although we didn't succeed, I think we inspired the population. We also inspired people politically in South Africa because the press in South Africa, which had inquired about the ANC for so long, now began to say ANC guerrillas are crossing into Zimbabwe, running battles fought around Wangi. So our people inside the country got the message that the ANC had been told by the media that it was kaput when actually it was there and fighting. And this was followed by an upsurge in student activity and the formation of the Black Consciousness Movement and SASO, which is the South African Students Organization. Our trial in Botswana got a lot of media coverage. So in a way, directly now, we had actually begun to influence and inspire young people about armed struggle. This was Hani. This was exactly what Hani had wanted when he had fought for the right to take war for justice forward when he was still at Kogwa. But it had been a year since that disparate crossing into Botswana to what was assumed to be safety. Hani and Dube had buried their weapons after stopping at a trading store close to Francistown to buy civilian clothes and had presumed their negotiations were on even ground when they were confronted by Botswana security forces in a dry river bed. They had reasoned that the Botswana government would be sympathetic to their cause, but it was also important not to jeopardize the country's newfound independence by giving the Pretoria regime an excuse to invade. Surely the Weru guerrillas would not be convicted. The men were sentenced to prison terms of between 1 and 6 years, and the Botswana security forces later convinced Dube to reveal the location of the buried arms cache. If Dube refused, he would have been handed over to the Rhodesians and probably faced the hangman's noose. 2 years into independence, Botswana's first democratic president, Sir Seretse Khama, was under considerable political pressure, both from his own country and from Britain, whose closest regional ally was apartheid South Africa. But the OAU and the ANC's highest official, O.R. Tambo, were determined to engage Seretse's government for the group's early release. In Gaborone jail, Hani too was agitating. At least the men had graduated from reading Enid Blyton books, all that was available in the beginning, to serious novels like Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and other classics, studied by a benevolent Oxford University, friends in the United States and Britain, and the library in town. Ironically, for the communists among the MK and Zipra cadres, someone had generously donated a Monopoly game for some capitalist entertainment. Ruth Mpati secured a Scrabble board and sent it to the prisoners. For the first time in years, Hani had the luxury of time to read for the pure delight of it. And here inside the cell, he also found a ready ear for talk about politics. Conditions were not harsh in the beginning. Prisoners were not abused and spent their days doing manual labor. Hani being assigned to water the plants and to do garden maintenance. Unlike the government, which had vacillated in its approach, the warders were sympathetic to the liberation fighters from across the border. Describing his time in prison, Hani later said to Wolfie Kodesh, It's important that you prepare yourself for a long grind in prison. A long grind. I was ready. I was not demoralized. There was a slight demoralization on the part of a few, but we would actually run up our spirits. There were comrades who felt bad about it. It's very difficult. It's degrading. Even the uniform is humiliating. You wear those pants without underwear. You don't have shoes. You sleep in those dirty blankets. It's a punishment, but we take it. You take the punishment in your strides, you see, because if I want freedom, then I must be ready to make a certain sort of essential sacrifice. In prison with comrades, I have had no food to eat. I really feel it, and I become helpless because I know how another must be feeling. But the revolution had to continue even in prison. An escape attempt led to stricter conditions and no yard time. And inside the cell Hani shared, there was dissension. The anger and frustration at not receiving any contact from their comrades at headquarters in Lusaka was borne out in plans, to rebel against their captors. The instigators of the campaign of non-cooperation later came together to take on a more formidable challenge now, which was the ANC leadership itself. When it was finally clear that the men of the Lutuli detachment were to be released, Tambo approached an old friend and confidant to house Hani. The young man had great potential but needed to be intellectually stimulated, the argument went. The responsibility now fell to Livingstone Mqotsi, an intellectual and devoted struggle exile who refused offers of money and welcomed the fellow Xhosa speaker into his home. After 18 frustrating months in jail, Hani will be a son of Livingstone and Nzimazana, and an older brother of Yvonne and Laurentia. But whenever visitors came to Mqotsi home, the quiet Hani will go to his bedroom with a book. When the house fell silent, he and Mqotsi could engage in discussions on the political situation in South Africa and on what needed to be done. A romantic, Hani enjoyed the writings of Shelley and Keats. Initially averse to classical music, Hani would over time come to appreciate the sound. Sometimes when reciting poetry in his bedroom, he would engage in animated conversations with himself, but soon the graduate of the battlefield had more than his fair share of visitors. Across Woodlands, the academics enjoyed the quiet of the middle-class Lusaka suburb. By 8 p.m. on a weeknight, most residents were settling down for bed. By midnight, the entire campus neighborhood was usually aslumber. A rumbling diesel engine would have seemed amiss at any time, but the grinding of gears and the throaty roar of the truck engine put paid to any other attempts at sleep. A light went on at number 10. An older man, swaddled in his robe, peeped through narrowed eyes and asked, "Is Chris here?" The young man at the door asked. He had been there many times before, like so many others, to enjoy the company of the eldest son of the Mqotsi household. But this time around, something was wrong. When Hani and his company had returned to Lusaka from jail in Botswana, a party was thrown for them at 250 Zambezi Road, the home of communists Jack and Ray Simons. Ben Magubane threw a party too, but surprisingly, disturbingly, there was no official welcome. The silence from the leadership began to eat at Hani. Within months, his confusion turned into disparate kind of fury. Finally, He put his name at the top of a list of 7 signatures in the Memorandum, a document that sought to expose the rot within the ANC's highest administration. The signatories, all former cellmates in Gaborone, gathered in Nkotsi's home in Lusaka, mostly at night after the dinner dishes were done and doors were quietly closed in the house as the children went to their rooms. In the lounge, Nkotsi and his wife would listen to Stravinsky and Beethoven on the record player and read quietly. Later, they will turn off the lights and the radio, check the locks on the doors and the window latches. The door to Hani's room would be closed, but inside there was a buzz of hushed conversations. For months, the comrades had discussed the betrayal of the revolution. The time had come for talk to be turned into action. A memorandum, a document that will honestly address matters. The risks were high. Dissidents often disappeared, but it was their duty, the duty of any true revolutionary. No one will be spared. The memorandum contained explosive allegations, and that was why the emissary arrived at the Mkotsi house at midnight that night. Hani had become a target, and the reason was only too obvious. In the document, names were named. It was claimed that one Thabo More, the name by which Jomdise was known, paid more attention to commercial enterprises like a furniture factory in Lusaka and a bond factory in Livingston. Initially, fronts of the ANC's underground activities, the businesses were now run as a true commercial ventures, ventures. More Omdise took a salary and owned a posh, militarily irrelevant car. He was becoming middle class. More's relative, Shadrach Tladi, was part of a trio that was openly flirting with members of the US Peace Corps, an alleged CIA front. At the time, Tladi and Joseph Cotton, the son of ANC Treasurer General Moses Kotane, handled much of the organization's highly sensitive information and transported war material. It was also stated that the wife of a prominent ANC official worked for an Israeli intelligence gathering agency. The memorandum reflected the sense among some comrades that the ANC's chief of security, Dumanogwe, was indifferent and cynical towards battle-weary comrades. It was understood that this apparent cold demeanor had upset Hani. In the camps, combatants who had offended the leadership were rumored to have been dumped in dugouts half filled with water without any protection from the elements for weeks at a time. There were secret trials and secret executions. MK Commander-in-Chief was reputed to have become a law unto himself, arbitrarily appointing and dismissing people, leading to the entrenchment of a culture in which sycophants prevailed. Particular rancor was directed at the ANC Youth League, and one of its leaders, Thabo Mbeki, was singled out. Hani and Mbeki were ideological opposites. While Hani went to war in Wanki, Mbeki was studying at the University of Sussex, funded by the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS, the white liberal student organization. It felt as if there was a clear nepotism going on. A hangman's noose had ended the life of MK Kader, Vuisi Lemini, while Wanki hero Basil February had died in a gun battle with the Rhodesian police. Countless others had been killed, sacrificed to the greater good. Meanwhile, some of the children of the ANC leadership were studying in Europe. Hani and others believed they would enjoy the comforts abroad and return home only once the battle was won. For this, he detested them. Quietly plotting in Mkotsi home, the 8 men resolved to demand a truly representative conference between the ANC's leadership and MK. One by one, the men signed their names at the end of the 7-page memorandum, and the document was delivered to the ANC leadership. A reply came soon enough. The knock on the door in the middle of the night was uncommon as a South African exile in Lusaka with strong links to the ANC. Mkotsi will occasionally get visitors such as Tambo, who kept odd hours. In recent years, more and more of those familiar faces knocked on his door to visit Chris. But no one had ever come visiting in a truck before. Is Chris here? Something inside Mkotsi told him to say no. And it seemed the young men were reluctant to push the point anyway. Without much left to be said, they clambered back into the Russian truck and drove off. But that was not the end. The next morning, after Hani had completed his routine run, Mkotsi sat down with him at the kitchen table. He described the midnight visit, his sense of trepidation, how he had lied. Hani thanked him without offering an explanation. Yet from Mkotsi, there was more going on than Hani was prepared to reveal. Mzwai Piliso, head of the ANC's feared security department, Mbogodo, had been another midnight caller just 24 hours earlier. He had come to plead with Mkotsi, his old Fort Hare classmate. Piliso knew Hani and his friends respected the intellectual. So he begged Mkotsi to use influence to convince the group to apologize to the ANC leadership. They had committed a grave offense. I've been sent here by the leadership. This boy is mine, said Piliso. Desperate, he waved the document in his old hand's face. It was the memorandum. So I think I will just leave that here and make it as part 1 so that we are able to can post it properly. Then we'll continue with part 2. Thanks for now.